So try not to swear. All right. Oh. Okay, let's see here. Give it a second. All right. We are live. Hello, everybody. My name is Joseph Cohen. I am a sociology professor here at Queens College in the City University of New York. And I am very, first of all, I'm here with several of my colleagues, co-director Jason Tugaw from the English department.
Hi, everybody. Brian, thanks for coming. We're really excited, and our journalism students are going to be really excited.
Yeah, this is awesome. Ryan Sperry is my collaborator in research on podcasting and content creation at Queens College.
Hi, everybody.
And we have Johnny Sullivan, who is the editor-in-chief of the Queens College Night News.
Pleasure to meet you. And again, absolutely want to echo Joe and Jason when I say that I'm extraordinarily grateful to you for appearing. And I know that this panel will be personally very illuminating for me. So thank you.
That's awesome. And we have just on the Zoom session, Britt, who is also from Night News, and my colleagues in sociology, Robin Rogers and Anahi Vladrich. All right, before we begin, if I can just take a moment to just promo just a couple things that are coming up. So thank you to all of you who are joining us in this series to talk with Brian Rosenthal, who is a journalist at the New York Times. We're going to introduce him in a second, but I just wanted to let you know about some upcoming events. Next week, we are going to be sitting down with Ben Lindbergh of The Ringer. Ben is a highly acclaimed sports journalist, baseball writer, and podcaster. He's worked for Fangraphs, Baseball Perspective, and now The Ringer. And so those of you who are interested in sports writing, sports broadcasting, or sports journalism, you're going to want to catch this. And then the following Thursday, we're going to meet Jay Acunzo, who is a podcaster who has done a lot of work on successful podcasting enterprises. It's he's a marketing and business oriented creator, and he's got a great mind for content creation strategy and marketing. And it'll be great to talk to him. And then finally, in the next week on Friday, March 25th, we're going to meet Rachel Skaggs from Ohio State University. She's part of a very interesting program that brings together business students and art students and teaches people how to succeed in the business of content creation. So without any further delay, though, I'd like to get to today's talk. We are thrilled to have Brian Rosenthal, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist with the New York Times, to come talk about the craft of research in journalism and in content creation. It is a real privilege to have you here, Brian. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So to get started, can you just tell us a little bit about your background, maybe your work on taxi, the taxi industry and other work that you've done, and how you got into investigative journalism to begin with?
Yeah. So I grew up in Indiana, and I kind of fell into journalism. I was really focused in high school on getting into a good college. And I heard that in order to get into a good college, you have to do a lot of extracurricular activities. And so I joined basically every extracurricular activity at my high school: the math club, the spelling ball team, the Boy Scouts, the service organization, the debate team. But I happened to join my high school newspaper as part of that. And out of all of those activities, I loved the high school newspaper the most. And it was just really fun to talk to people and find out stuff about the school. And I wouldn't say that I did a lot of investigating then, but I was very into this idea about finding out things that other people didn't know or didn't want me to know. So when I went to college, I got into a good college at Northwestern, and the first thing I did when I got there was I joined the college newspaper, the Daily Northwestern, and that's why I'm so happy that we have the editor of the night news here, because the college newspaper really had a huge impact on my career and my life, where I learned to be a journalist, and where I met some of the people who had a big impact teaching me to be a journalist and remain some of my closest friends. I eventually became the editor of my college paper. I actually started an investigations desk at my college paper because I thought we should be doing more investigative stuff. We exposed a secret society at Northwestern, which was fun. So I had that experience. I did 5 internships in college at 5 newspapers in 5 states. And one of them, the Seattle Times, actually then hired me on after I graduated. And so I worked in Seattle for 3 years. And then I got a job, actually a former boss from one of my other internships reached out to me and asked me to apply for a job in Texas. And so I ended up moving down to the Houston Chronicle, and I was in the Austin bureau writing about Rick Perry and Ted Cruz and all the personalities down there. And that was a great experience. And in my last year in Houston, I was there for 3 years. And in my last year, I got a tip about special education in Texas. And that turned into my first real investigation, which was a year-long investigation into the denial of special education services to kids with disabilities in Texas. And that story ended up doing really well. I mean, it led to laws being changed. As a result, the state of Texas decided to spend $3 billion more on special education. And I was a finalist for a Pulitzer for that project. And that got the attention of the New York Times. And so they actually called me and asked me to interview up there. So I don't know if you sense the pattern, but I've never actually successfully applied for a job. I unsuccessfully applied for a bunch of jobs between there, but I think one of the lessons is that in journalism, it's based a lot on who you know and the work that you do, more than cold applying for jobs. But anyway, I came to the Times about 5 years ago now, and I'm an investigative reporter on the Metro desk. I've had that job since I came here, and I do in-depth stories about New York City and New York State. My biggest story to date is I spent 18 months looking at the taxi industry in New York, and published a 5-part series about predatory lending and market manipulation in the taxi medallion industry. That won the Pulitzer, a couple of years ago now. Now I've been working on some other things, and I'm actually about 6 or 7 months into a project right now that I'm pretty deep into. But yeah, that's my my life story basically.
I have a follow-up question. Which personality, who's right for a career in investigative journalism? I'd imagine that this line of work is not for everybody. So what do you need to succeed in that field?
I mean, I think there are a lot of different types of people who can succeed because there are a lot of different styles. I mean, some people are really all about data. And if they have that kind of mind, they can craft stories out of numbers that nobody else can. Some people are great at documents, finding documents, understanding dense things. Other people are great at interviewing and getting people to open up and share their problems in life or things that have happened to them, or convincing sources to give them information. So you kind of need all those skills, but I think there are different types of people that are good at each of those different types of things. I would say the number one thing is that two biggest things are, which are related, are creativity and persistence. Because a lot of what we do, I joke sometimes that investigative reporting is just like regular reporting, but with more time. But the reality is a lot of what we do is we know we need to find some information, and the conventional ways that you would go about finding the information, like a reporter might do on a daily story, isn't working. And so you have to be creative and persistent to find other ways to get that information. So, if you're somebody that can kind of think outside the box, and certainly if you're somebody that has this is actually a surprisingly valuable skill in investigative journalism, the persistence, but also the ability to handle tedious work for long periods of time, because it's often not nearly as glamorous as you think it will be.
Okay, so I thought what we do is I wanted to ask you just about your larger process so that people who aspire to the type of content that you produce could get an insight into your method. And then I thought after that we would open up the floor to questions to about anything that people want to know, either here on the Zoom or in the live chat. But I wanted to start by asking you, how do you get started on a story? Like, some people might want to do what you do, but they say, well, where do I get ideas? How do I even get started with this? What do you recommend?
Well, I think coming up with the idea for the story, I think is the hardest part of what investigative journalists do. I would say the two biggest things are, first of all, just talking to a lot of people. The Texas story about special education came about because I decided I'd never done an investigation before, but I decided that I really wanted to do a big investigation. I had no idea what I wanted to investigate. And so I basically just called everybody who I knew, all of my sources from my beat reporting. I called 75 people, emailed 75 people, and I just said very bluntly, hey, I want to do a big investigation. What should I investigate? And, I got 75 different answers. 74 of them were terrible. But one of them turned into this incredible story. And so, that's kind of when I talk about like persistence and being willing to do tedious things. But so part of it is just that, like, there's be talking to people. Obviously be curious, notice what you notice, and always looking out for things. And then the other thing I'll say is just reading. I get probably most of my stories just from reading other news stories and then thinking about it. And what I mean by that is, so there'll be a story in a local newspaper in, rural New York about somebody dying of something. And I'll see that and I'll be like, whoa, well, how often does that happen? Does that happen a lot in New York? Does that happen more in New York than other states or other big states or other Democratic states or other states in the Northeast? Or more now than it did before? You can just think critically and come up with all sorts of interesting questions to ask. One of my favorite stories I did recently was about hospitals suing their patients for unpaid medical bills during the pandemic, which they were not supposed to do because the governor had said you got to put a pause on any of medical debt lawsuits. And the only reason I got that story was I had read in the Texas Tribune that Texas hospitals were suing their patients for unpaid medical bills. And I said, well, it's happening in Texas. I wonder if it's happening here. So yeah, just reading a lot is a surprisingly good way to come up with ideas.
Does anybody, Johnny, you got a question about stories?
Yeah. So I would say that one of the things that the Night News benefits from most is a seemingly never-ending wealth of resources from which to draw when you write local stories. We also enjoy the full collaboration of the administration, even when we write articles which might be more critical of them than they would like. So I'd have to imagine that the dynamic in a professional newsroom is a bit different. And I'm curious what you do when it seems like the well is running a bit dry on sources for further information.
I mean, it depends on the story, but my general philosophy is that more people know about something than you think, no matter what the thing is. And so, I mean, take the taxi driver example for a second. Like, that was about taxi drivers being suckered into loans. And so you would think that the sources for that would be the banks that gave the loans and the taxi drivers. But it turns out there are actually way more people that know about that than you think. There are the brokers that are involved in setting up the loans. There are the lawyers that are involved in writing the contracts. There are people that work for those people. There are people that know those people. There are regulators at the city that oversaw the taxi industry. There are regulators at the federal government that oversaw the banks. That there are so many different people that may have come across something and may be able to help. And so that's when I talk about creativity. It's like thinking, who could possibly have known something about this? And then, you call them and you give them a shot, and the worst they can say is no, then you're back at where you started. So I make a ton of calls that go nowhere, but again, sometimes it works out, and then it doesn't really matter about the 100 calls you made before. Nobody, when you read the story, you don't read about the 100 calls that failed. Right. So all that matters is the information.
So, sorry. I just want to clarify what he does, and then I'll let you follow. So what you're saying, Brian, is when you get an idea, you ask yourself, who could possibly know anything about this? And then you just hit the phones and you just look for people who might be able to share nuggets with you. Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
And correct. And what I also do is every conversation, there are 3 questions that I always ask. One of them is just like, is there anything else that I didn't ask that I should ask, which is standard. But then I also, first of all, I asked, do you have any documentation? That's my favorite question. And then second of all, maybe most importantly for my reporting process, I ask, is there anybody else that I should talk to? If you were me, who would your next call be to? And so, yeah, it's a lot of hitting the phones and then trying to get, once I have a set of names, trying to get more names. And if you're doing your job right, like by the end of your reporting process, you have way more people to call than when you started, because everybody's giving you ideas for additional people.
So is it a matter then of building up a network of resources personally, or does the Times have sort of a directory of people that you could start with?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, the Times does obviously have some relationships with people. I wouldn't say there's a directory like written out, like, oh, I'm investigating the tax. Let me just look that up. There are definitely a lot of resources in-house. And I mean, part of your job, just if we skip past the first part of what I do when I am launching an investigation, which is I read everything that's been written about that topic, and look for people who've been quoted. Those are the first people I call, but also look, when you're at the Times, there's a lot of institutional knowledge. So look at who wrote a story on something related to what you were interested in.
So I have a question. So you read up, you get the names of people, you start networking and get some questions. Where do you store? How do you organize all of this information? Like, what's your method for documenting it and organizing your thoughts?
I will answer that, but let me just add something on to the last answer, because there's something else I meant to say. Because you talk about building a network of people, I actually do think of it that way. When take the taxi project, which I spent 18 months on, the first calls that I made, which gave me some basic information about the taxi industry, would actually not that helpful or ended up in the New York Times, because I had no idea about anything at that point. I didn't really know what the story was, and I didn't know the questions to ask. But those connections that I made early on in the reporting process, those are then, once I have my list, which I organize, which I'll get to, a lot of times I'm then going back to people weeks or months later, and I'm saying, okay, we had this initial conversation. I have some much more specific questions to ask you. And it's those conversations that really form the backbone of the story much more than the initial conversations. In terms of organization, that's something that I am kind of obsessed with, and I spend a lot of time thinking about and working on a daily basis. First of all, I have a log of all my calls and all the people who I've talked to, but also the people I've reached out to and how many times I've reached out to them and how I've reached out to them. But I also have a very specific system for keeping my notes and kind of just the spirit of the project. I have one Google Doc, and I think it's important for me for it to be in one place, in one document. And then I use the outline function on Google Docs. Are you familiar with this function? Life-changing. Just allows you to like see everything and click on it and go there immediately. But on that Google Doc, I'll have headers for my to-do list, like my short-term, like priority to-do list, my longer-term to-do list, like the questions I need to answer, the things I'm thinking about. I will have subheaders for the clips, news articles about the topic, links to documents or data or reports. I will have just some random things for random topics that come up along themes that emerge from the reporting. Have people that didn't respond or have people that didn't comment. And then I'll have all my interview notes, which will be, again, organized using that outline function, and I'll break it down. I mean, the taxi example, I'd have a subhead for taxi drivers, and I'd even break it down from that. I'd do, taxi drivers who had bought their medallion at the height of in the bubble, at the height of the bubble, versus people that had it from earlier. I've got a subheader for bankers, and I'll break that down into like current bankers versus former bankers. Sometimes I break it down into like helpful bankers versus unhelpful bankers. But I have it all broken down, and then I have a header for writing, which is very important, because as I go, the way to not approach this is to report on something for a year and then sit down at the end of the year and be like, okay, what should I say about it? You need to be thinking about it along the way. And so I'll be constantly putting in ideas for structure or different themes that emerge, or different, when I'm like in the shower and a random sentence of beautiful writing comes to me, I'll put that in there. And quotes, key quotes that I want to use, I'll put that in there. So when it comes time to write, I'm really ready to go, and I know what I'm doing. So
I got to think there's all sorts of follow-up questions on this one. No, Robin, did you want to ask a question?
I do. I just wanted to ask a question about students. I find that a lot of my students, when they go to do their first real research projects, qualitative research projects, which are very similar to journalism, feel that they're students and therefore no one will talk to them. And I always tell them the opposite, People love to talk to students and help students. So is there anything you can, sorry, that's my fresh direct. I'm going to buzz them in 1 second. Is there anything you can say to the students about leveraging their status as a student?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think, yeah, sometimes I think I should say I'm a student, so more people would talk to me. People think that if you're at the New York Times, more people are willing to talk with you, but actually that's really not always the case. A lot of people, either they get scared off by that big name, or they have some, personal feelings about the New York Times, about the bias that they think the Times has. And so
Right.
a lot of times, and that goes both ways, by the way, a lot of people think we're liberal, but a lot of liberals also think we're too conservative. And so a lot of times when I'm talking with people or reaching out to people, I'll make a point like, hey, you're not talking to the New York Times today. You're talking to me. You're talking to Brian Rosenthal. And, they can complain about past coverage. And I'll say, well, that wasn't, this is our opportunity to set the record straight here. That wasn't me who wrote that. And so I think it applies to students as well. Like what people want to, the people they want to talk to are people who are willing to listen. And it doesn't really matter where you're coming from. It matters the attitude that you bring into the conversation. And so, yeah, I mean, I think students actually do have some advantages, but also it's really about what you're bringing to it more than anything else.
Britt?
So, first, thank you so much for being here today. I'm really happy that I have the opportunity to listen to you speak. So my question was, how would you go about writing like a well-informed op-ed? Like, what are the differences in research that would go into an op-ed versus like a different type of article, like maybe like a hard news article?
I think I've never written an op-ed. I'm almost thinking like back to my high school debate days of like what would be the most persuasive way to go about it. I mean, obviously, when I can tell you the difference is that an op-ed is trying to drive somebody to a certain opinion or a certain action, and that's not my goal when I'm writing the story. I always think about my goal as being to expose something that's happening. And I'm not really going to tell you how to think about it. You can decide yourself how you want to think about it. And I'm not going to tell you what to do about it. You can decide what you want to do about it. But I'm presenting you with this information about something that, if I spend a lot of time on, I probably think it's important. So that's the difference. I mean, in an op-ed, obviously the similarity is you have to get people's attention. You have to keep their attention. You have to keep them interested. And I think you have to form a narrative that is clear and consistent and nuanced. I don't think anybody, certainly with an investigation, if you don't have the nuance in there, people are going to write it off. But I think that's true for an op-ed too. And also like mixing in data and personal stories and logic, I think is just really important. So it's probably a terrible answer because I've never written an op-ed, but those are the things that popped into my head.
That was terrific. Thank you.
Go ahead, Johnny.
So I notice that in some of the articles you've written for the Times, they aren't op-eds like you say, but some of the titles are certainly a bit provocative, like Andrew Yang promised to create 100,000 jobs. He ended up with 150. There's obviously some implicit sort of angle there. At least that's what my perception is. So it would seem to me that if there's something being exposed, that there's sort of a presupposition that there's some miscarriage of justice taking place, and that there's something which is unjust. So I'm curious what you would say to that.
Yeah, I was wondering what the question was going to be. Yeah, I mean, I think anytime you, as I said, you choose to write something, especially if you spend a lot of time on it, that is like saying something itself, right? And we put it on the front page, that's saying something itself. And the headlines, absolutely. I don't actually write the headlines. Reporters don't write the headlines. But yeah, I mean, that's all true. I think that, I guess where I see the distinction is that, like, I don't have a problem as an investigative journalist saying that something is bad or deserves attention. Like, kids being harmed is bad. Like, we can all agree on that. Like, it's not compromising journalistic objectivity to say a kid with autism should get help with services. So I think that the difference is that I am coming at it from a place of showing what's happening and not like, okay, let me we've kind of backed into this question in an interesting way with the question about op-ed, but if I am reporting on something and I find that the evidence or the truth is actually not what I thought it was, or it is mostly what I thought it was, but there was some conflicting evidence, as a journalist, as a news reporter in the investigation, I'm going to be grappling with that and discussing that and being open about that. And if it shows that the whole story isn't true, then I won't even do this story. I'm not sure you would get that in an op-ed, right? Like, they are going to look at the evidence in whatever way they can to make the point that they're trying to make. And so from my perspective, I'm actively trying not to do that. Like, if I encounter evidence against what I'm saying, then I put that into the story. Does that make sense?
I have a question. Is the difference kind of in our field, in academic publishing, there are people whose primary work is to collect evidence and bring facts to light, and there might be opinion encoded in it, but the primary purpose of the pieces that they create is to bring out evidence. And then there are others who the primary piece is to frame evidence that has been brought out by other people. So one is saying, here's some stuff you never knew, and an op-ed piece is, this is what you've already known, and here's how you should think about it. Is that maybe the difference, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. But I also think that, I mean, we do a lot of what I do as an investigative journalist is framing of information that is out there. So it's not an absence of framing necessarily. I don't know that that's what it hinges on. I think it hinges on what is your goal? I mean, that is ultimately how I think about it. If your goal is to say something that's happening in the world, in my opinion, that's journalism. And if your goal is to move somebody to a specific emotion or an action, I think that's opinion. And so a lot of it, in my opinion, is just in the process and how you approach it. And it's one of those things that you can't really, it's not like there's some checklist that you can do an easy definition that this is news because it has these 5 things, and this is opinion because it doesn't. It's a little more subjective than that, unfortunately.
Ryan, you got a question?
Yep, sure. And you have me thinking about questions about this now, but I had something different. But maybe we can come back to that. You are obviously printing in, the New York Times. This is the premier place to put your printed word, whether it's online or in the paper, or at least one of them. What do you think about other kinds of media? Do you have podcasting? Do you believe in like television and like one theme is, I think it's overrated, but people say, printed word is dead and all that stuff. I don't think that's happened quite yet, but what do you think about like the future of media or using other media to get your story and work out there?
I think it's great. I mean, and with the Taxi Project, we did an episode of the New York Times TV show, The Weekly. I also was on the Daily podcast, and honestly, doing the Daily and doing that weekly episode were some of the most fun parts of the whole thing. I mean, it was new to me, but you reach a different audience and you can do some different things. It's kind of a different type of storytelling. I think it's great. I mean, I'm definitely not wedded to print. We don't subscribe to the print New York Times. We don't subscribe to any print, anything, even though my partner works for Condé Nast, the magazine company. We read everything online. And to me, the great thing about the internet is so many more people are reading the work that journalists are producing. And that's really the bottom line. Or I should say consuming the work with these different mediums. But I really don't think the medium matters. What matters is reaching people. And so these other mediums are a huge benefit because they help with that.
Jason?
Hi, yeah, thanks. You've been so articulate about your work, and I think it's going to be incredibly helpful for our students who are here now, but also who will watch it later. And I'm thinking about them when I ask this question, and it's about sources who probably won't want to talk to you because they don't want this story out. And I'm wondering kind of how you handle that. I imagine it takes different shapes. I'm wondering if you have a particular story that might kind of illuminate how you deal with, unwilling sources or skeptical sources, and that might kind of give students some advice.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends. It depends on the source. And I think the approach can differ. I'm thinking about a story I did in Texas about the agricultural commissioner who was using taxpayer money to fly to another state to get this crazy medical procedure done called the Jesus shot. Look it up. It was a crazy story. And in that case, I knew if I called him and said, hey, I'm a reporter with the Houston Chronicle, and I'm writing about this terrible thing that you did where you are illegally using taxpayer money to go and get a stupid medical procedure. And do you have a comment about that? Like, that wouldn't have worked. What I ended up doing is I caught him out at an event where he was, just among the people. And I said, hey, I told him who I was. I said, I'm a reporter with the Houston Chronicle. Hey, I heard that you just went to Oklahoma to get the Jesus shot. How was it? And he's like, it actually worked out pretty well for me. So sometimes it's a matter of the approach and going in, and, you wouldn't want to do the first thing that I mocked a second ago anyway, because not only would it be ineffective, but it's not really fair either. I mean, you're not really listening to that person's perspective. And a lot of times I try and go in. I mean, my general strategy is to go in with openness, genuine openness to what they have to say, and also confidence that I'm going to do the story no matter what. And so, I mean, you said they wouldn't want to talk to me because they don't want me to do the story. Well, I mean, I've a lot of times I say, like, hey, we're writing this story no matter what. It's your choice whether your perspective is included or not. I want to include both perspectives. That will make me very happy. If you make the choice that I don't get to do that and I only have to have one side of the story, I don't think that's good for either of us. But that's a choice that you get to make. And all I can tell you is I'll listen to what you have to say and I will give it serious thought. And that works most of the time. So that is something I say a lot. I also, when I'm talking to, I think there's a question that just came in about talking to, how do you organize to classify info? Connect. Okay, I'll get to that in a second. When I'm talking to victims or more people who, it's not a matter of getting their perspective in, it's a matter of do they want to open up and let me in, which I thought this question was about. But when I'm doing that, the thing that I stress is, again, that I want to genuinely listen to them, but also that they are not the only one who this happened to. And if they want to help other people, this is a real opportunity for them to do so. So those are kind of like my two go-to lines, depending on who the source is. Should I answer this question in the chat?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Yeah. When you reach out to taxi drivers at airports, how do you organize or classify the information from your initial interview and make it connected to all parties involved? What do you mean by connected?
G, do you want to explain?
I can't find the right word to talk about connect. How do you know those parties would be kind of responsible for this issue?
Are you asking, like, how does he know how to organize the information that he gets? Like, does he develop a framework for his story before he goes into the field? Is that?
Yeah, it's the first part is data collection, information collection, and second part is how could he authenticate these infos, and what are the other parties would be responsible in this issue?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll mostly tackle the second half of that. I mean, on the first, in terms of, I talked about organization. I do think before I go into anywhere where I'm collecting data or collecting information, which is what an interview ultimately is, I do try and have a strategy for it about what exactly I'm trying to get out of it, and think about, again, what's the most effective way that person is going to give me the information. As far as authentication, it's a great question. Taxi drivers specifically, everybody who's in that story that is confirmed with documents. When we feature somebody in a story like that, we do insist on, complete transparency, and I'm not going to include somebody that you have a $50,000 loan, for example, unless you can show me the paperwork of your $50,000 loan. And I also tell them that, hey, just so you know, it's not that I don't trust you, but my job is I have to verify everything. And so I will be calling the bank to make sure that this is real. And we do that. We would never include anything. Well, I guess I'm careful about the word never, because I'm thinking about there might be some instances where we would say, so-and-so said this, though they were not able to provide any documentation or something. If we were to publish it, we would have to say that. But for the most part, we would not publish anything unless we had received independent verification of it. And if they don't have the ability to do that, they're probably in the case of the taxi story, there were thousands of other people who could. So a lot of times it's just a matter of, okay, well, we're going to have to talk to somebody else.
You snap a photo with your camera? Is that how you document these things? You just take photos, or?
Often, yeah. That is the power of the phone. Yeah. Very helpful.
Johnny, you had another question, Johnny?
Yeah. While we're on the subject of calling, have you ever encountered a situation where you've called a party you've believed to be in the wrong and left the phone call with an entirely different perspective on the issue? And as sort of a corollary to that, could you speak to the importance of leaving all your preconceived notions of a situation at the door when you make these calls?
Yeah, well, the answer is yes. And I'm trying to think of an example I could say, because like if we ultimately found that it was not true, like I don't want to like say like an allegation against somebody that wasn't even true. But I'm thinking, for example, about well, recently, I had spent so much time investigating the taxi industry, and I got an anonymous tip from somebody who said, well, you really should look at the head of the Taxi Workers Alliance, which is this union that says it supports taxi drivers, but actually fill in bad stuff that was in this anonymous tip. And we took it very seriously because we were like, well, we have actually a special obligation to look into this because we spent so much time, they were a source of ours, and we want to bend over backwards to make it to look into this. And I really thought we were going to be writing a story about it. And I was, proud of how seriously we were taking it. And then we called them, and they gave us proof that it was not true. And so we didn't do that story. So anyway, that happens. Obviously it happens on a smaller scale with different things all the time. Yeah, absolutely. It happens. I mean, in terms of going in with an open mind, it's really a matter of getting the best story, because I mentioned before nuance. I mean, the world is nuanced. The world is not black and white. The world is gray. And so if you go in with a black and white mentality, you're going to come out with a story that is black and white and is not, first of all, not true, but also not compelling, as I alluded to earlier, because it doesn't, you just can't, you can't make up things and have, for the most part, in my opinion, and have it ring true to people. Yeah.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just gonna. Well, I was gonna say, is it that like it's hard to come up with a story from your imagination that you haven't already heard before, and probably when you look at information, you have the chance of developing an actually novel story that somebody hasn't already told you. Is that kind of what's going on there?
The truth is, I mean, we're not even talking about making things up, but we're just talking about when you have a kind of rigid mentality about one side being completely right or one side being completely wrong. That's not the way that life really is. And it's not going to, I truly believe that the most compelling stories are the true to life stories. Life is stranger than fiction, right? You can't make it up. And so you have to kind of embrace all of that nuance in my opinion. And so yeah, I mean, that's the biggest reason why I think that's so important. I mean, and it also is like the job, and that is what we're taught to do, and we take that very seriously.
We have a question from the chat box from my colleague Ani Vladrich, who's an ethnographic researcher and faces similar question or situations to yours. She asks, what's the most difficult situation you've ever faced while doing your investigative work, and how'd you manage to get what you wanted? How'd you manage to deal with it?
Hi, Brian. Actually,
You stumped me.
I have one of those bad hair days, and I'm from Argentina, by the way. So I don't want you to get a bad impression. But I learn from the things I do wrong the most. And lots of the things you're talking about are things that we face when, hi, I'm here to understand how you sell at Botanicas, for instance, how you sell mercury. You cannot address it that way, right? So I've been in myself in very difficult situations, and sometimes it's discouraging, and sometimes you want to change and switch gears to a different topic. So I was thinking, what is that aha situation that probably marked your life. On another day, I can share mine, but this is your podium today.
Yeah, I appreciate it, and I've certainly had difficult situations, have stories that I haven't been able to nail down. That's what kind of pops into my head first. I'm trying to think of a good answer for you, frankly. But the first thing that pops into my head is just, the stories that have gotten away. I mean, there was a story when Eric Schneiderman, the former Attorney General, was in the news because the New Yorker published that he was a domestic abuser. We were working on that story as well, and we were working on we had some other allegations related to that we were looking into. Again, I don't want to share too much specifically because we were not able to prove it, and it was a really big story at the time, and we really wanted to do it, and we just couldn't. And we had some sources, but we just couldn't get the corroboration that we needed to. So that was frustrating. That type of thing happens often. Again, you don't read about that. You don't read about the 2 months that we spent. That was a total waste of time. I'm trying to think about a situation with an investigation where there was a piece of information that was very difficult, and we had a creative way to get at it. I don't think this is an answer to your question, but I'm going to say it anyway. Because it was a big challenge, and we did manage to get around it with creativity, which is that we were trying to prove that with the taxi story that a large number of taxi drivers had been financially ruined by the predatory lending that was going on. And of course, we talked to taxi drivers, but that was anecdotal, and we wanted to put some numbers on it. And we kept hearing that taxi drivers had filed for bankruptcy, and I really wanted to put a number on just how many taxi drivers had filed for bankruptcy. And that is harder than you think it is, because it's not like when you file for bankruptcy, there's a box that you check that's like taxi driver, yes or no, and that's tabulated somewhere that you can look at it. And you can't even, there are way too many bankruptcy filings to go through each one individually and look at the assets that they're listing. And you can't even do, well, I'll tell you what we ended up doing. We ended up getting a list of all the taxi drivers, of all the people who own taxi medallions. Now, such a list didn't actually exist, but there was a list of people who had bought taxi medallions over the years. And so we kind of used that as a proxy list. Even though it included a bunch of extra names because people had bought it and sold and, whatever. And, but we kind of cobbled together this list, and we actually hired a software company to compare it to the bankruptcy filings list. And so we had a list of like 50,000 taxi drivers. And we compared it to the, 500,000 people who had filed for bankruptcy, and we were trying to match up the names. And we got about 3,000 matches, which is great, except that was the easy part, because there could be a taxi driver named John Smith and somebody who filed for bankruptcy named John Smith. And how would you know that the person that filed for bankruptcy was the taxi driver, John Smith? Mm-hmm. So we had to go through each of those 3,000 individually. And we did end up going through all of those filings to look at the people who listed taxi medallions as their assets, or talk to their lawyers. We found some lawyers who were doing a lot of these types of cases. And so, we were making hundreds of calls. We were looking at thousands of filings. And at the end of the day, we were able to determine that about 950 taxi drivers had filed for bankruptcy. And that became a line in the story. So we spent I had a team helping me with this, and we spent months on this, and it became one sentence in the story. So when I talk about like tedious stuff like that, that's what I mean. But obviously that was difficult and we had to be creative. So I don't know, maybe that's a helpful answer.
Oh,
Great
it's a super
answer. Mhm.
it's a super relatable story for anybody who's doing doing research, that's for sure, professionally. We're almost out of time, and there was one question that I wanted to make sure that we got in. So a lot of us, we deal with young people who aspire to be journalists, but any type of content creator. They're just expressive types and they want work in media or something like that. And I wanted to ask you, do you have any advice generically for any young person who wants to be in an expressive profession, but they don't really know where and they don't really know how? Can you give them, just something to put the wind in their sails, a little piece of life advice that might help them on that journey?
I don't know about life advice, but I can tell you that I'll tell you what I did when I was trying to figure out what type of journalist I wanted to be, and I became interested in investigative journalism, and I wanted to become an investigative journalist. I think you need to read a lot, if you're interested in a different creative field, consume the type of content that you want to produce. And what I did, which was important to me, was consuming a lot of journalism and trying to figure out what stuck with me, what moved me, and then tried to deconstruct how they were able to do that, and if I thought that I could do it. And I still do this today. Like, if I read an article that I find to be really compelling or really well done or powerful, I will read it multiple times. I will read it slowly, and I will make it into a game. I will try and figure out, okay, how did the reporter get that piece of information? Who was the source that gave it to them? How did they find that source? How did they convince that source to talk to them? What did they say to the source to get them to give them that information? And why did they choose to write it that way? Why did they choose to put it in that place after that sentence and before that sentence? And I try to figure out what they did, and then quite honestly, I just copy it. I don't copy the words, obviously, but I copy the process that I imagine that they went through. And it's a crazy thing, but you realize that it's really not that complicated. And you can do anything that any professional content creator is doing. You just have to kind of force yourself to do it. And with any type of content creation, you'll get better, you'll find your voice, and you'll become more effective the more that you do it. And so your goal is just to do as much as you can, and things should work out.
All right, one last question from Jason.
Okay, that was a great answer. And I just want to say we have a workshop with Night News writers next week, and I'm going to have them take one of your articles and do exactly what you just described, because it's going to be great for them. And I just want to point out that I think what that answer about reading and kind of deconstructing the article complements something else you said earlier, which was noteworthy, that you did internships with 5 different papers, and that through that you established relationships with people that really led to your career.
Indeed. Thank you.
Brian Rosenthal is an investigative journalist with the New York Times, a Pulitzer Prize award winner, and somebody who is very generous to aspiring journalists with us and in general. So I'm very, very grateful for the time that you gave us, and just for what you do for, the young people who are coming up, because you're known for that. So thank you very much, Brian. It was really great to meet you and learn from you.
Thanks, Joseph. Good to
All
see
right,
you.
we're going to end the live stream. Hold on.